All right. I'll hang back for a bit to check in with my folks, Coco said, as she followed James into his room, as he quickly checked for anything important. He couldn't forget, here, when they were leaving in quite the hurry. I'll catch up to you once I know everything's fine with them. James gripped his still mostly packed suitcase by the handle with his mechanical arm, and easily hoisted the heavy thing up onto the bed to inspect its innards. Finding nothing immediately amiss, he exhaled in a short burst. Just because we're going to have to go into hiding doesn't mean that we'll have to drag you along as well, he replied, and briefly rifled through the stacks of clothes with his fingertips. Those rumours mostly focus on me. Everyone else is kind of treated as a faceless soldier, so you're probably not associated enough to really become a target. In the meantime, while he had made sure everyone was getting ready and everything was going to go smoothly with their pickup, he had taken a few quick minutes to look into the stories that had been spun around the data leak in the net. The general gist of it revolved around him finding and trying to hide that AI, and, in a manner that he can only describe as somehow, he supposedly also bullied the entire UHSDF and governments of 2 planets into going along with that plan, which was just so not how any of this worked. Seriously, he didn't even get the memo that data had been leaked at all, but sure, he had the necessary influence to make one of the galaxy's strongest militaries just buckle to his will. Honestly, he almost wished these rumours were true, because that would mean that he was a whole lot less powerful than he felt right now. Jamie, you're bonkers if you think I'm going to leave you alone to take my vacation with everything that's going on right now, Coco simply replied, with a serious expression and a firm headshake. You already lost an arm for this. Knowing that it was pointless to argue, James shrugged and began to smooth out the stacks that he had roughed up in his luggage. Well, I can't do more than offer, he mumbled, almost more to himself. You vastly outrank me. Having found some articles during his rifling that had become a slightly less good fit than they had once been over the past months, mostly due to him bulking up quite a bit since he had started his more serious training again, he quickly moved to exchange them for some other articles that were still left in his wardrobe from years long past. As he moved, he pulled Coco's eyes along with him, and as they moved, they soon became stuck to something she noticed on the wall. Not saying a word at first, she slowly walked past him, towards the wall in front of which the large cat tree was standing, and she gently reached out to an item that was mounted there. You still have this? Coco mumbled, as she pulled the tiny metallic item from the nail that it hung from. Small, dark grey, almost black, the cross framed by a downwards pointing pentagram laid in her gently closing hand as she inspected it. What? James asked, as he turned around to see what she was talking about, and it took his brain a good few seconds to make the connection of why she was even asking the question. When it finally came to him, his eyebrows raised a bit, and he shook his head slightly. Oh no, that one's mine, not the one I took from the guys in the jungle. Reason took that one from me almost as soon as we got out. Yours? Coco asked in slight disbelief, raising an eyebrow as she looked over to him and allowed the symbol of the Church of the Failed Saviour to dangle from her finger to present it to him. Yeah, James said with a shrug, and pulled his selected few shirts and pants from his earlier military days out of the cupboard to store them away. I dabbled a bit with it during uni, although I think I was a member for less than a year, ultimately. Coco's face scrunched up slightly, and she briefly looked back and forth between him and the item hanging from her hand. Never pegged you for a religious type, she mumbled, and stared at the symbol for just a moment longer, before hanging it back onto the wall. Although even then, she still gave it an almost distrustful side-eye, as if she feared that the thing would come to life and try to harm them at any moment. James sighed, as she finally slammed his luggage shut. It was a weird time in my life, he informed her firmly. Certainly wouldn't happen again. Coco scoffed slightly, but seemingly dropped the issue. I'll check on the other lieutenant, she then announced, and quickly made her way to the door. James looked after her for a moment, before zipping his suitcase shut completely and hoisting it off the bed again. Since he had been busy with wrangling his uncle in the meantime, Sheeta had already long packed and was now waiting in the living room, sitting on the large couch. About a hand's width away from her, spinach also laid curled up, and every now and then, the larger feline glanced over at the smaller one with a distrustful gaze, seemingly making sure that it wasn't doing anything stupid. "Well, this didn't last long," she then commented, her yellow eyes looking into James's as she noticed him coming in. He gave an exhausted exhale. "In hindsight, it was probably foolish to think it could have gone any different," he mumbled, and briefly averted his eyes to blankly stare at the wall. "If it hadn't been this, something else would have come up. It's all just too much to get away from." Before he knew it, there were suddenly arms wrapping around him from his side, embracing him tightly. Either he had been a lot more lost in thought than he had expected, or Sheeta had actually tried to be sneaky here, because he had 100% not noticed her getting up and walking over to him. She didn't say anything, and neither did he. He just put his arm around her, and they hugged for a few long seconds. Then, there was a very hesitant, almost clearing of a throat that sounded more like a slightly broken up breathing that interrupted the silent scene. Having been thoroughly ignored so far, the two young influencers with colourful hair now shot up into a slightly straighter sitting position when James and Sheeta glanced over towards them as they let each other go. The sheepish look on Simon's face indicated that he had been the one to make the noise, and James wasn't entirely sure if he had intended to interrupt them, or if he had simply been worried that their hosts weren't quite aware that they still had company. "The police will get you out once our escort is here," James announced, deciding to completely ignore what had just happened. Simon just meekly nodded. Nicola, on the other hand, seemed to become angsty in her seat. She shifted her weight around a bit, and the muscles of her face kneaded her features as she was seemingly stuck in a battle with herself. Then, in a burst of energy, she lifted her hands and brought them heavily down onto the couch again, causing a drum-like sound to fill the air while she shut her eyes tightly and almost sprang to her feet. Once she stood, she opened them again, and her greenish eyes focused right onto James with a determined look. "Before that happens," she loudly announced, and leaned forward a little bit, making her extremely long hair fall around her body like a cape, "would you be willing to—" "I am not allowed to give any statements on the matter right now." James shut down the obvious question before it could even be fully asked. "I can give you that much on record, though." Nicola seemed to deflate, as all the air and tension she had built up within her body in preparation to ask the question escaped her at once. The whole scene was so exaggerated that Simon awkwardly chuckled next to her. "Leave it, Trix," he then suggested to his partner, as he relaxed slightly and leaned against the backrest behind him. "This is a couple of sizes too big for us." Nicola began to shift her weight again as she mulled that over. Then, with slightly renewed vigour that expressed itself in her clenching her hands into fists, she suggested, "Maybe we can just get a picture?" Although it was asked in a passive form, she looked at James like she had asked him directly. James exhaled slowly and lifted a hand to his chin. Well, there certainly was no rule against this one, so it all came down to if he actually wanted to or not. On principle, he was leaning more towards the not side of things, but he had to think a bit bigger than principle here. After all, public image was something that he now more than ever had to suddenly be concerned about, and at least according to his uncle, these two were at least somewhat well known. There was also the fact that their tour of the premises had been thoroughly ruined by his presence here. Granted, that was a much bigger inconvenience for him than it could be for them, but it was still something that happened. And it wasn't like it was a secret that they had met. He was already on video with them. Therefore, they had legitimacy if they started talking about their experiences with him, so maybe he shouldn't make it as unpleasant as he could. Slowly, he exhaled again. "All right," he finally said, after weighing his options, "but only if you keep the tags you put on it to a minimum, and certainly don't add any that might suggest an opinion or leaning of mine." He lifted an eyebrow at her, seeing if she would go along with those conditions. Nicola's face lit up. "Only our social tags in your name, promise," she guaranteed him. Behind her, Simon started to stand up, a surprised and almost impressed look on his face. "You'll probably sue us out of existence if we break it anyway," he inferred with a chuckle, while he moved over to get some of his equipment ready to take the picture. Not inaccurate, Sheeta confirmed offhandedly as she watched him. However, her ear twitched slightly and pulled her attention forwards again when Nicola moved a step towards her and stared at her intensely. And you? The green-haired girl asked, and Sheeta almost immediately grimaced, clearly at first having the very same thought of no way that James originally had. That would certainly boost the post beyond belief, Simon additionally mused to himself, although it was in a language that the feline wouldn't understand. Sheeta seemed to weigh her options for a bit, and ultimately glanced over at James, who only shrugged in reply. He definitely wasn't going to try and convince her of this, but he also wouldn't dissuade her. Although, in honesty, he was surprised that she was even considering it. Oh, what the hell, she finally mumbled so quietly that likely only James heard it, before speaking up a bit as she said, Sure, why not? Within less than a minute, Simon had gotten his camera onto a tripod, scouted out the best lighting in the room, and set up the lens to capture all four of them from a good angle. The guy knew what he was doing. James had to respect that much. The orange-haired lad then quickly instructed them on the best way to stand and posture together. As he let himself be slightly repositioned by the meek shove of the influencer, James realized how much work a public image truly could be, even at minute moments. When he had heard take a picture, he had thought of something like a quick selfie or something, not a planned-out photo that you could basically frame on your wall. All right, smile, Simon then finally announced, as everyone stared into the lens, and after a few quick clicks of a button that he held subtly in his hand, it was over, and he and Nicola hurried over to the camera to inspect the results. James followed them after a moment, and looked down at the final picture as well. He and Sheeta stood close to each other on there, his arm vanishing behind her back as he held her. Nicola seemingly stood next to him on the picture, although in reality, she had been standing almost an entire step closer to the camera, now making her appear a lot bigger in the picture next to him than she actually was, while she leaned towards the camera and held out a hand with all but her ring finger extended. Surely some sort of symbol of theirs or something. Meanwhile, Simon stood completely off to the side next to Sheeta with a neutral expression, and his hands in his pockets, only glancing at the camera instead of looking straight at it. I'm going to see that all over the news come next morning, aren't I? He mused, while watching the two influencers already discuss what exactly they would have to adjust in the picture in their post-production, and what exactly they should use as a headline for it. It seemed these kids were a lot savvier than James had given them credit for, given that they were in their element. Only if they're willing to pay a fortune, Simon mumbled, as he swiped his finger along the picture in thought, seemingly planning out some edits he was going to make in his mind. We're protective of our brand. Loud footsteps on wood from behind them then announced that people were descending the stairs from the upper floors. It seemed that, slowly but surely, everyone was getting ready. Therefore, it was probably time that he checked on Flynn again. Excusing himself with a wave, he quickly moved through the connection hallway towards his uncle's room. Stopping in front of the door for a second, he breathed deeply, in and out, before using his knuckles to knock 3 quick times. "Here?" a gruff voice came back from the inside. "Just me," James replied. "You doing okay?" There was a moment of pause from the inside of the room. "Just a few last things. One moment," Flynn replied, and James concurred, crossing his arms and taking a step back, to lean against the close-by bathroom door. Whatever Flynn was doing in there, it wasn't loud enough to be heard through the door, and so James stood in silence for a bit, with his arms crossed as he waited. After approximately 5 minutes or so, the door finally opened, and Flynn stepped out with a huge, unwieldy suitcase that looked almost more like a wooden coffer than a piece of luggage. James watched his uncle fight with the cumbersome thing for a bit, and commented, "I'll never get your fascination with old shit. Usually there is a reason it was replaced by something better ages ago." "Shut your yap," Flynn gave back in slight strain, as he finally managed to maneuver the unwieldy box through the door. "You kids just don't have any class." Then, after catching his breath for a moment, Flynn looked up at James and his face turned slightly more serious. There was a brief moment of him seemingly fighting with himself, as his stern look faltered a bit. However, he then strictly overcame it with a determined grimace, as he pulled something out of his pocket, basically shoving it into James's hand. It was a small, clear bag, filled with very finely chopped up bits of dried plant. "You're in control, kid," Flynn mumbled gruffly, and avoided eye contact for a few seconds before his gaze finally searched that of James, their dark eyes staring into each other for a long moment. "Just don't make it a cold one." James stared down at the bag for a few more seconds, before closing his fist around it and nodding, pulling his uncle into another hug. Soon after that, there was a loud ringing that filled the house. James was the first to walk up to the front door. Pressing a button on a small terminal next to it, he could see the feed of the camera that was attached next to the entrance to the compound, where a number of uniformed people were now seemingly waiting for them. Pressing another button on the same terminal, James activated a connected intercom saying, "We'll be right out." After that day, time slowed to a crawl and flew by them simultaneously. Seemingly overnight, the same kind of protests as had broken out in front of the compound started to happen all over the world, often in a much larger scale. What had just been an internet rumour for a long time was suddenly developing into a large-scale movement from one day to the next. The timing was so perfect that there was basically no doubt that it was not a natural development, but had really been planned for a while. They had seemingly just waited for James to show his face on Earth again to start. That much was also clear by the sheer resources these protesters had at their disposal, almost at a moment's notice. Obviously, as protests had become more common and widespread, the UHSTF eventually had to make official statements on the matter. They still tried to play things close to their chest, but they assured the people that there was no need for the displayed hostilities, and that James most certainly didn't hold the influence ascribed to him by whoever was leaking the data. Not even 2 hours after that statement had been made, caricatural pictures began floating around the net and news. In a comic strip-like format, they show many long lines of masked, uniformed soldiers, most of them stemming from some sort of pop culture medium that had been famous over the years, all of which had one of their indistinguishable ranks standing at the front and guaranteeing a horde of faceless people that everything was fine and that there was nothing to worry about, while their compatriots were threateningly raising their weapons at the people from behind them. The same picture repeated a number of times, jumping from one iconic evil pop culture army to the next with each iteration, until finally they arrived at the last picture, where the movie villains had been replaced by what clearly was supposed to be soldiers of the UHSTF, easily identified by their dark uniforms with red accents and star-like dots sprinkled across them. Just like in the previous pictures, the soldiers had been turned into faceless masks, as each of them was depicted wearing one of their standard breath filters, and they threateningly raised their weapons at the concerned citizens, while one of them stepped forth and assured everyone that there was nothing to worry about. Like all the other soldiers, the one in the front was also obscured by a breath filter, like all the others, although in an admittedly somewhat clever twist, you were still able to identify him as James if you paid attention, because the artist had made sure to depict his right hand as James's dark grey and textured prosthetic. The comparison was quite obvious, of course, and it conveniently left out that the UHSTF basically never wore their breath filters while on Earth, because why would they? Still, it was effective. Not change everyone's mind on everything immediately effective, of course, but it was one rock on a huge pile. No way they made that on the spot like this. James remembered Admir ranting over the phone, as he had called him on the matter almost as soon as the pictures had been released. They had this shit ready to go, no doubt about it. They were just waiting. The drawing alone would have taken more than 2 hours. With the protests picking up in intensity, their at first precautionary stay at a military base had of course soon turned into a more permanent one, as just relocating James and those closely associated was a lot easier than giving him permanent security detail. Not that he didn't have that as well, at least whenever he went out. Although he had by now basically been cleared of any suspicion of causing the data leak himself, it wasn't like the UHSDF or the government were going to take their eyes off him in times like these. And although the stress of these days seemed to slow time down quite a bit, the fact that no major changes occurred in these times also made it all somewhat blended together. Therefore, despite every individual day seemingly dragging on ad infinitum, looking at them in hindsight, it was always surprising just how much time was flying by as they spent their days in an ordered routine on the Lorraine base. Although some interesting patterns did emerge in the meantime. For example, it was quite easy to tell if a news network was in support of James, or the protesters, based on what picture of him they used when reporting on him or the situation. Were they on the side of the protesters, they would use a picture of him during his addressing he had made shortly after being rescued from Ostrander, on which he stood imposingly in a well-lit studio, addressing the people looking haggard from his imprisonment, but dressed in his full uniform. However, where they were more leaning in his direction, they would use the picture taken by Nicola and Simon, which looked almost like it had been taken by a group of friends in a casual setting. Apparently, those two had ultimately caved, as one of the major networks had indeed been willing to pay a fortune, as they said. Though, to the kids' credit, they did contact James before sending the rights for the picture to ask if he would be okay with it. They also offered him a cut of the earnings, although he told them to please just donate it instead, as he wasn't exactly tight for cash. And although it had never been his intention behind that action, the fact that they excitedly told that story to their many followers had inadvertently earned him some points with the younger generations. Overall, those two had become quite the advocates for James and against the protests, which was a quite fortunate twist of fate. Not that there weren't plenty of other figures speaking out on his behalf or against him, but with those two, it felt a bit more personal, and at least James liked to imagine that the people felt that, so it wasn't all bad. Another positive was that, since the base in Lorraine was a quite large one, it meant that they had quite a few possibilities in using the base's resources, since they now lived there, forced to or not. And since they couldn't really leave all that much for a bit, they had a lot of time to do just that. For James, that didn't mean much more than that he got back into a way more regulated training rhythm, as he took part in the base's daily life, which included training, along with his fellow soldiers. Sheeda, on the other hand, started to make full use of the time and resources she now had on her hand. After all, her contract with the UHSDF did still include a few stipulations before her full rank would be granted to her. And just like she had been in her youth when she fervently trained and learned to make it to a place where she would be accepted into the communal military, she was now more than determined to vigorously chip away at those, now that she had the opportunity to. Physical and mental assessments, intensive language, history, and tactics courses, specialized weapons training, and dozens upon dozens of flight hours in ships ranging from unkindness to barbarity class, familiarizing herself with the differences between communal and human ships, Sheeda did it all. It was like something within her had reignited, now that she was back in a full-scope military setting, without much to get distracted by. "Unbelievable," she said one day, after coming back from a bit of an extended training flight that she took on one of the largest ships of the fleet, getting her knowledge on piloting Habitat-style ships up to snuff. 10 years, she said. And James just assumed that she was talking about Earth years here, given the context. 10 years I spent in the communal military, trudging along through the ranks and celebrating every snippet of new responsibility given to me. After 10 years they put me behind the gravity control of a Habitat-style ship for the first time. And now? Having crossed half the room in her rant while James followed her with his eyes, Sheeda now jumped into their shared bed, throwing herself through the air backwards and landing on the mattress with a bounce, making an almost aching sound as she did so. Her demeanour while walking and heavy breathing indicated that it had been a long day for her, and that her muscles now demanded a break. However, in no way did it seem like she was regretting anything. 3 weeks. She finished her earlier sentence, leaning her head onto her hand, while she rolled over to look at James directly, even as she laid down. 3 weeks between me arriving on Earth and me getting to stand at gravity control. I mean, I know, it's not really comparable since at this point I've done it all before. But come on, 3 weeks? Exasperated, she rolled herself around again so that she faced the ceiling now, breathing slightly heavily as she looked up at the light shining down at her. You have 10 years of experience. That's why you were hired in the first place, James mumbled, and briefly turned to face his computer again so he could finish typing an already started sentence in one of many long-winded reports he was writing out in his function as an ambassador, now that he wasn't involved in external affairs for a while. What are they going to do? Give you training wheels? They want you ready as soon as possible. Experience or not, that's still so much time that just feels wasted now, Sheeta mumbled, and started to roll up into the blanket a bit. Ordering the lights of the room off, she stared over at James's brightly shining computer screen that illuminated the room in a dim twilight all by itself now. Are you going to be long? She asked after a moment, and her reflective eyes gleamed from the darkness as they caught the screen's light. James exhaled slowly, and quickly finished typing out a last few sentences that he had already laid out in his mind, just so he wouldn't forget them in the meantime. Then, after hammering the save hotkeys a bunch of times, and checking for confirmation that it had actually been saved, he closed the laptop. Nope, he groaned, into the now completely dark room, and stretched himself extensively, pushing his arms back over the backrest of his chair. I'll finish up tomorrow. Then he got up from his chair and slowly skulked over to where he knew the bed to be, simply falling into it as soon as his feet had hit the frame. Although they both would still very much have to change before actually going to sleep, they allowed themselves to lay like that for a bit, just ignoring the world in the darkness. Do you think he ever wanted me to become a captain? Sheeta suddenly whispered right next to James's ear, her voice hoarse and almost toneless. After taking a moment to fully realize just who she was talking about and why, James shook his head slightly in the darkness. I don't know, he whispered back. Maybe. He wanted you to symbolize something for him, so maybe, but I doubt you'd have ever gotten to that point. Sheeta was quiet for a moment. Then he could hear her swallow heavily. You think he'd have asked me to do that stuff as well? Stalk people or plant bombs? She then asked quietly. Again, James couldn't really tell. Maybe, he replied once more. I don't know, but even if not him, someone probably would have. He could feel Sheeta nod next to him. I wouldn't have done that, she said quietly, almost sounding like it was more for herself than for him. I wouldn't. Following people, maybe, but not bombs. Not with someone innocent involved. Someone innocent. Well, of course James wanted to believe that too. The Sheeta he knew certainly wouldn't have done that. However, maybe things weren't so simple. After who knows how many years of indoctrination, who would even be able to tell who is and isn't innocent anymore? The idea of something vague like innocence could become extremely muddied over time. Still, those were all maybes, and this was reality, and this Sheeta right in front of him had put everything on the line for someone innocent. That was much more important than any ifs, ands, or buts. I know, James therefore whispered, and pulled her in a bit closer in the darkness. He felt her hands clench into fists as he held her, and she pressed her face into his chest tightly. That night had already been a few weeks ago at this point, but it stuck out in James's memory, mostly because ever since then, Sheeta had been going about her training with yet even more vigour than before. Both Coco, who seemed to have taken a liking to Sheeta that went beyond her usual attempts at getting close to everyone James dated, and the Admiral were actively supporting her in her endeavours with great enthusiasm, and James wasn't quite sure what exactly to make of that fact. However, the work got Sheeta a whole lot closer to her dream of one day being the captain of her own ship. That and the fact that she had something to sink her full attention into, so that she didn't have to think about the galaxy coming down around them, seemed to make her happy. And with Sheeta being happy, well, who was he to go around grumbling about people supporting her? Meanwhile, James, and with him entire armies of analysts of course, were constantly paying very close attention to the things that were going on in the net, both in and outside of Earth's confines. The planet's death or status had more and more turned into a blessing in disguise in this situation, as any media coverage by people from outside of Earth's territories was sparse at best. It turned out that it was harder to report on things if most of your reporters couldn't even set foot on the planet in question without eventually being crushed by its pull. Even more so when that planet had largely isolated itself and its territories from most of the rest of the galaxy in recent times. Therefore, news of the protests happening in Earth were slow to spread, and even slower with being accurate, meaning that so far the threat from the outside, in addition to the one from the inside, had been rather moderate. Although, if he was being honest, James didn't exactly trust that whole thing. After all, the news had been slow to spread on Earth at first as well, before suddenly exploding to a worldwide scale overnight, which was clearly an orchestrated endeavour. Who said that the very same thing wasn't being carefully planned for the entire galaxy at this very moment? Also, it wasn't entirely obscure. The people knew that there was something happening on Earth, if they only cared to look closely enough. That much was clear when one day, a very concerned call came through on the planet, right next to the blue giant.
Yes, hello. You have reached the residence bistri.
More pleasantly greeted the call, coming from an unknown number, curiously rubbing one of her claws along the notches of her horns, as she allowed the computer terminal to pick up a visual connection, in addition to the auditory one. When the picture changed, her face lit up in surprise and elation, as she saw 3 very familiar faces look back at her.
Oh my, she said,
her claws dropping to her mouth, as she held back emotions while her eyes became wet, after her gaze had fallen onto the faces for her children, all together for the first time in what felt like ages. Slipping into her native tongue, she added,
Now this is a surprise.
Kenta, her oldest, who had the same beautifully bright fur and sharp eyes as her father, looked at her mother with a mixture of worry and relief.
Hello, Mother,
she greeted, also in their native language, and her siblings soon chimed in with greetings of their own.
It's been a while. How have you been?
Moore didn't reply at first, and instead took a moment to look at all her children. The beautiful Kentra, her Muin, so dark in fur that he looked like the opposite of his sister, and the tiny Humwa, who looked the most like her mother. Well, she wasn't so tiny anymore, now that she was a grown woman, of course. Even her youngest was about James's age, after all.
Oh, I cannot complain,
Moore said, her hand still in front of her mouth.
Not with such a lovely surprise in front of me. How about you? How have you all fared? You're always so terribly busy, Kenta. Is your business going well? What about Vrinko? Is he good to you?
Kenta exhaled in a slightly annoyed tone at first, although her face quickly fell into a more relieved one, almost as if she was glad that her mother had annoyed her.
He is very good to me, Mother,
she gave back, in an unusually calm and gentle tone, and the business is running great. I, too, cannot complain.
We had to reroute the ship a couple of times, due to the Parisian now closing their borders as well. But apart from that, everything is going smoothly.
Maureen then chimed in from his side, and looked similarly relieved to his sister.
Zarabi and I had a very pleasant celebration for our first 5 uniform months together recently. It was only a small one, but we're already planning for the one for 10 months, and we're intending to make it a lot bigger.
Moore brought her claws together in mild but happy shock.
Goodness, has it been that long already?
She asked no one in particular, in a breathless mumble.
Oh, I am so endlessly sorry for not calling. So many things have been happening that it completely slipped my mind. You simply must remind me the next time. Please, I would not miss your celebration for anything in the galaxy.
Wing chuckled slightly awkwardly, while Moore finally turned her attention to her youngest.
What about you, Humwa? Are you holding up with your studies? I hope the money is not getting too tight on your end,
she said in a deep, motherly worry that was brought on by nothing in particular.
Oh, no, everything's fine, Mamma, Hornwell replied, and her claws started to glide through the fur around her neck in a bit of nervousness. But, actually, it's all coming to a close pretty soon. The last exams are around the corner, and I'm very confident that I'll pass them all. It seemed that, originally, Hornwell had wanted to say a bit more than that. However, Moore couldn't quite help herself from interrupting her youngest daughter, exclaiming, "Oh, how wonderful! Surely we have to celebrate it. When will the ceremony be?"
All three of her children were quiet for a moment, and they exchanged some vague glances with each other that Moore couldn't quite fully interpret. Ultimately, it came down to her youngest to take up the word again. "In about a uniform month, if all goes well," Hornworth said, with a slightly meek tone, sounding simultaneously proud and hesitant. "I'm going to send you an official invitation once we get them, of course, but we wanted to call ahead since you're so far away at the moment and all."
1 month, Moore mumbled again. My, how time flies.
Then she quickly shook her large head and brought her hands down again.
"But far away or not even a fleet of warships will keep me from being there on your big day," she then proclaimed for everyone to hear. "I will simply have to rent a temporary abode for the time I am on Thors again."
Apparently seeing her opportunity, Kenta sat up a bit straighter and loudly chimed in. "That won't be necessary, Mother. We've already taken care of finding something fitting for you. It's a nice little place close to the city centre, and only a few blocks down from mine in Vurinkos. I guarantee that you'll love it."
Moore chuckled at first, mumbling, "Typical for you, Kenta. You think I am senile already, do you not?"
But then, she thought about the way her daughter had said it for a moment longer.
"But what kind of place is it? Certainly does not sound like a hotel with the way you are describing it. Is someone renting out holiday homes that close to the city centre?"
Kenta cleared her throat for a moment, and now also rubbed a claw along one of her horns, causing a loud grinding sound.
"No, nothing like that. It's a small flat, or more of an apartment, really. I paid a small deposit and reserved it for you, so it would be ready once you arrive," she informed her mother, slowly.
Moore needed a moment to fully realise what she was being told at first, and she blinked a couple of times, while the words of her daughter ran through her mind.
"An apartment?" she wondered aloud,
as saying the words helped her better process it.
"That might be a bit much for a brief stay on the planet, is it not?"
Her children fell quiet again, and glanced around at each other. This time, it ultimately came down to her only son to be the bearer of the news.
"Well, we have been thinking," he said,
and his head turned so one of his dark eyes could focus solely on him.
"And we thought maybe, if you wanted, you could move back to Thors permanently again, now that you are not working anymore."